Now we'll take a look at the virtue theory of Confucius. Now, as I noted before in the introduction to Confucius for his background, Confucius didn't write out this work, so it's not something he sat down, wrote out, edited, etc. It's essentially his students recording what he said. Also, one thing, especially if you compare this to Aristotle, who argues pretty much everything, there are really no arguments in supporting Confucius's views. He essentially asserts claims and then doesn't back them up with arguments. It's a different approach to philosophy. One could say that the entire work could be seen as kind of an appeal to intuition, that this seems to be appealing, therefore should be accepted. But there is, especially in contrast with thinkers like Aristotle, there is a lack of argument. So I won't be saying like, here's the argument he gives for this, here's the argument he gives for that. It's simply essentially reporting what he said. And one could agree or disagree, one could argue, against it or for it. So a fundamental virtue for Confucius is respect for authorité, or authority if you prefer. Now, he doesn't mean sort of a mindless respect for an obedience to whoever happens to be in charge. He believes that this respect for authority is a respect for an authority that has to be properly, morally grounded. So he's not advocating mindless obedience. He's advocating respect for, virtuous authority. And he takes the approach that, and this will seem probably familiar to most people, is the idea that there's this view that if you have people behaving well, respecting their parents and elder brothers, and it's important to note that he references elder brothers and not elder sisters, his claim is that this will result in them, extending that sort of respect to the authority of others. And so this is the notion that, we might say today, respect begins at home or virtue begins at home. And he claims that the gentleman or sage or virtuous person, variously translated, works on what is translated as the trunk of goodness, the foundation of it, that proper behavior towards parents, and once again, elder brothers. Sisters are not mentioned. He also notes and references, presumably, you can imagine Confucius presenting a lecture, referencing these 3 points of examination, which are 3 questions to ask. Again, no arguments backing them up, just if one is going to be, you have a practical sort of test for being virtuous, here's 3 questions one could ask. First, in acting on behalf of others, have I always been loyal to their interest? Which is an interesting approach because it notes that the important thing is not, being selfish and serving one's own self-interest, but when acting for others, to be acting for them. Second is, common virtue, which is honesty. To ask, have I always been true to my word? And the last is the part of the ritual thing, which is the question, have I failed to repeat the precepts? Which presumably one should not do that. Today, probably wouldn't be following, the precepts, but I guess this could be like words of affirmation or, presenting one's moral code or views. So in terms of people's duty, and virtue theorists, typically, they build duty upon virtues. So we'll soon look at our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. He embraces deontology, and duty is based on rules, following the correct rules. Now, Confucius notes that one looks at a young man's duty, again, as sexist, in the sense that although parents are mentioned and wives are mentioned, there's not reference to like young women or sisters, etc. Today, of course, you could broaden this, but during his time, of course, sexism, and also in our time, sexism's kind of a thing, or pretty much a thing. So here are the duties of a young man as Confucius viewed them. Once again, tying back to parents and elders, to behave well towards one's parents at home and to elders abroad. Good advice he gives is, of course, to be cautious in giving promises and impunctual in keeping them. Essentially, don't just promise anything, but if you do promise, keep your word. To have kindly feelings towards everyone and to seek the intimacy of the good, become, good. And he notes that if a person has still has time left, then study the polite arts, arts of good behavior. So the four virtues of the way of the true gentleman are these. And Confucius does give quite a bit of practical advice. In some ways, this is reflected in modern books about, advice about how to be. I wouldn't want to say like self-help books, because Confucius is not, presenting kind of this self-help view, but he's presenting the idea of how to improve oneself, guidance for this. And virtue theory is often aimed at being very practical. So, in private conduct, be courteous. In serving one's master, be punctilious, which I've probably horribly mispronounced. Also, in terms of in a position of authority, in providing for the needs of the people, to give them more than their due, essentially generosity. And exacting service from people, being just. So, Confucius's view is that one should be, we consider, generous and not selfish and not greedy. So again, he's looking back at the past, but his view of like how people should be is not, selfish, greedy, etc., but to be generous and also to not extract too much from other people. So more guidance for actions. So be faithful to superiors, keep all your promises, which is a good reason to consider what you promise, because if you're obligated to keep them, make sure that they're worth keeping. Now, one thing he says, which is also something similar to what Plato said, which does create a bit of controversy, which is refuse the friendship of all who are not like you. And that could be, depending on how you interpret it, it may sound like, a bit elitist. Also, like with a modern interpretation, it might be seen as being, say, racist, sexist, classist, etc. Essentially that you should only be friends with people like you. And this would seem very much to go against, virtue, depending on your conception of virtue. Some people, of course, someone who's a racist, sexist, classist would say, hey, this is the way to be. Now, as I noted, Plato makes a similar sort of claim. And so our good dead friends, Confucius and Plato, advocating, this sort of, exclusion. And the answer in part is yes, in the sense that you're supposed to refuse the friendship of those who are not like you. But the question is, what do they mean by the not like part? Like, is it that you shouldn't be friends with people who have a different, skin color, different gender, different sex, different political views, different, they play a different class when they play Baldur's Gate 3, what is he talking about? Well, the general interpretation, and a plausible one, is this. They're talking about morality, essentially that people who are bad, if you're going to be good, you should not be friends with bad people, with people who are full of vice. And it's, kind of the view that parents often put forth when they don't want their kids hanging around with bad influences. And on the one hand, this could be seen as good advice, don't be around the bad people. But it does raise the question of, well, what about the people who are bad? Who's going to, say, help them or, improve them? And there are ways around this. One could presumably help people without being their friends, or maybe the bad should be abandoned. So it's important not to interpret Confucius as being, say, exclusionary here in terms of like outside of morality. He also gives very good advice, which people often do not take, which is this. If you make a mistake, do not be afraid of admitting the fact and amending your ways. Now, today we often, we're supposed to have that view, admit your mistakes, and that's being the bigger person, change your ways. But psychologically, people are, not surprisingly, they're not very inclined to do that. Even in things that are incredibly minor, like a lack of knowledge about something. It supposedly is pretty common if you ask somebody about like a movie or a book or, an athlete or something, and they don't know. And of course, there's no shame in not knowing these sorts of things, that people will essentially lie. They'll say, oh yeah, but then they'll be kind of vague about it, as opposed to saying, oh no, I don't know. Please tell me about this. And then when it comes to actual mistakes that have consequences, people are less inclined to do so. And in part, one reason for this is because culturally, at least in the United States, we tend to punish people for admitting mistakes, even if they admit the mistake and take steps to fix that. Kind of the exception is, of course, sort of the fake apologies that celebrities make, etc. In which case, sometimes we accept them, sometimes we don't. But Confucius takes a view: admit mistakes and correct them. And this seems, from a rational standpoint, reasonable. Next, in terms of behavior, essentially, he says, when away from home, act as if you're in the presence of an important guest. Basically, behave well. And then some other advice, such as deal with the common people as though officiating an important sacrifice. The idea being essentially act in a way that you are very, respectful and proper. He also gives a moral view that will sound quite familiar, which is this. And now, we've heard of the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And people sometimes talk about the silver rule, which is not do unto others, but do not do to others what you would not like yourself. And some people have made an argument or a case that this is superior to the golden rule, because the golden rule is about doing things to people, and the silver rule is about, not doing things. But probably both, similar sort of thing. They both involve the method that I call reversing the situation. In this case, it's so you're deciding what to, do. And the thing is, don't do what you wouldn't like. And the idea is that if, according to him, if someone does that, acts in ways that are not things that they themselves would dislike or hate, then he believes this will avoid opposition. People, be it a state or a family, that if people, essentially saying if people treat others in a way that they don't do to them what they would not have done to themselves, like, harming them, saying terrible things about them, abusing them, exploiting them, etc., there'd be less trouble. He also believes that if someone is frivolous, they'll lose the respect of others. So don't be frivolous, according to him. Now, again, he keeps no argument, so I can't really go through and say, here's the argument he gives for this, here's the pluses and minuses, the flaws, etc. It's essentially things one should do and should not do. So he next presents, as his useful advice, the 9 cares of the gentleman. Which are these? When seeing, it sounds almost like a old 60s folk song in a way, although much older, obviously. In seeing, be careful to see clearly. In hearing, be careful to hear distinctly. So the idea is essentially, he's not just saying like, have good perception, etc. He essentially is saying is be careful about, one's perceptions. In terms of looks, be careful to be kindly, be respectful, be loyal, be diligent. He also notes an important bit of advice, which people often do not follow today, which is this: when in doubt, be careful to ask for information. And always a problem. People often in doubt don't do this. And of course, especially today, a lack of doubt, and of course, a lack of looking for information. Virtue theorists also often focus on anger as an important thing because people often do the bad things when they're angry. And Confucius, not surprisingly, says, when angry, have a care for the consequences. Another important focus of virtue theorists, and all virtue theorists I've looked at, like Confucius and Plato and Aristotle and Wollstonecraft, etc., they're always very concerned about, gain, wealth, property, money, etc., in terms of their relation to it. And it's a big part of, human civilizations, property, possessions, power, etc. And our civilization is built almost entirely around, money, wealth in its various forms. And so the relation between being a good person and wealth is an important question. Now, the virtue theorist is not opposed to wealth or success. We'll see this in other virtue theorists, and they pretty consistently across time and space have kind of the same view, which is this: if you see a chance for gain, you wouldn't automatically say, no wealth for me. So virtue theorists generally don't advocate, living in abject poverty and doing without anything. But what they do advocate is you have to determine whether pursuing gain, whatever form, would be consistent with the right. So what they do is they put virtue, goodness, above gain. So if one can gain and be good, then acceptable. If one can't gain without being, not virtuous, then no. Which of course leads to debate about which is more important, wealth or goodness, etc. And what should you do about when you have that conflict between morality and gain. Our society has largely answered that in favor of gain. So what about goodness? Now, not surprisingly, there's quite a bit to say about this, including more about wealth. So if someone can choose, has a freedom to choose, this kind of goes back to being friends, who you pick your friends to be. If one does not prefer to live among the good, and you're free to choose, then that would not be wise according to him. And he believes goodness is very important, virtue, that if you don't have it, you cannot long endure adversity, and kind of surprisingly, nor long enjoy prosperity, that it's an important quality. Now, in terms of why be good, it's a question that not surprisingly comes up in all moral theories, but is most directly addressed by virtue theorists. So in some cases, people pursue goodness or virtue in the belief that it pays to do so, essentially looking at it as having extrinsic value, and that it's a gain, that good, it's kind of like Ben Franklin said, honesty is the best policy. Not that you should be good because of goodness sake, but for the sake of it's practically the best. Now, Confucius claims that if you're set upon goodness, you won't dislike anyone. Interesting view. Now, returning back to wealth and goodness, as we saw, the virtue theorists do have this sort of, complicated relationship with wealth. And Confucius' view, as I noted before, is consistent with other virtue theorists. They all, again, regardless of time and place, they almost all seem to take this view. So, yeah, he recognizes people want wealth, they want rank, they want power, but if you can only get them by being bad, by giving up virtue, you shouldn't have them. People, of course, detest poverty, and lack of fame, but if you can only avoid being poor or avoid lack of fame, etc., by being bad, then you, according to Confucius, you must accept poverty. So the view essentially is nothing wrong with wealth and power, etc., unless getting it and keeping it results in becoming a bad person. And poverty and obscurity are bad, but not as bad as being bad. So he puts forth the view, again with no arguments, that if you really care about goodness, that would be your first consideration. That's what would matter the most. Which leads to a broader question of ethics. Is being committing to ethics, is that the primary thing? And of course, you can ask this question in other normative areas. For example, for religious people, should their religion be primary above other considerations? For someone who is, working for the government, should obeying the law be their primary consideration, setting aside, family, religion, ethics, etc. Now, he thinks that, if you really care about goodness, that's what comes first. And you would avoid wickedness, because if you're constantly doing good, wickedness would never have a chance to get at you. Now, he does note, kind of realistically, that no one has managed to do good with their whole might, even for a single day. But he also says that no one has given up the attempt because they've lacked the strength to go on. I guess his claim is that people give up before they, before they should. They could keep doing so, or so he claims. Which raises important questions about how hard is it to be good, and could you realistically just, be able to resist wickedness, the appeals of wickedness, and be good? Now, as I noted before, moral theorists have to answer the question, typically, if they're trying to get people to be good, why be good? And virtue theorists, pretty much across all time and space, have a standard answer. It's almost like, there's a universal virtue theorist handbook out there. Again, even across, time and space when people really couldn't have been obviously trading notes. So the standard answer for virtue theorists is this. Hey, virtue theorist, why should I be virtuous? And their answer is being virtuous makes you happy, essentially. Now, Confucius makes some pretty bold claims that if you're good, you can never be unhappy. And as Aristotle would say, that does not seem to be, true. Because presumably you could be good and unhappy. That seems to be a real possibility. And he claims one who is wise can never be perplexed, one who is brave is never afraid. Those all seem to be untrue. I mean, they're kind of good, I guess, bumper sticker or meme sayings, but seem untrue. But of course, one could argue that perhaps if someone is truly good, they'll never be unhappy. If one is truly wise, they'll never be perplexed. And if one is truly brave, they'll never be afraid, which leads into debates about what is it to be truly good? What is it to be happy? What is it to be wise? What is it to be brave? Confucius also brings forth the notion of moral force. And this is accepted by various other thinkers throughout history. Dr. King is a good example of this. He talks about soul force, referencing something very similar to moral force. So Confucius takes the view that one should rule by moral force. And the reason for this is because he thinks that this will be better from a practical standpoint. This, as I always say, is one of those still disputed ongoing questions in ethics and politics, which is if you're trying to have effective government, how do you do it? What is the secret to stability and order? Now, the usual approaches are, oversimplifying things grossly. One is essentially by using the compulsive force of the state through regulation, law, police, etc. Basically, the gun and the prison. And the other approach is, moral force, essentially by, having good government. Now, Confucius' view is that using, force, regulations, etc., punishments, people will, in his words, flee and lose all self-respect. This will be a bad way to govern. The alternative, which he thinks is better, is governing by moral force. He thinks people will keep their self-respect and they'll be drawn to this. Now, for the most part, we pretty much just try the, force. All the governments I know of are all based on, the gun now, obviously before like swords and spears and stuff, but based on the gun and prison and punishment and hurting people. And thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and others, they make the case that that's the only way it can work because people are basically bad and you have to, beat them into line or they'll be bad. Others, like Confucius, again, he thinks people are basically good. And so it would make sense that he would think that moral power would work. And as far as I know, I can't think of any, my field of expertise is not, history throughout all the ages, but I can't think of any well-documented, known, historical government that ruled by moral force as opposed to, force. But an interesting question. And it's, one, of course, well worth considering because the use of force to keep order comes at a very high cost for those who are the victims of it. So that concludes essentially our second look at Confucius. Because of the length, I'll split it up into a couple of videos to keep it from going too long. So in our next exciting video, we'll take a look at the doctrine of the mean. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.